Welcome to the Climate and Coordination RCAST, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and our chain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, our chain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
Okay, welcome to today's Climate and Coordination RCAST. This week we have a variety of topics that we are very happy to be discussing and bearing witness to. There's also a lot going on at the co-op. So first, let's just jump right into it. This is sort of a depressing story, I'm sorry to say, but I have a slightly more interesting, well, not more interesting, but slightly more uplifting, potentially, story happening after this. But the first one I wanted to talk about is really has to do with the climate refugee crisis. And this comes from CNN, and it's from August 20th. And I wanted to share it because for weeks now, possibly months, we've been discussing just the coming climate refugee crisis and just the speed at which it's starting to unfold, even in richer nations that experience what I call a lot of climate hubris, which is sort of an attitude that the rich nations won't really experience the effects of climate as much. And I think that's because probably just the delay at which certain rich countries have experienced these climate disasters. Like, you know, they're not, our infrastructure, for example, is not as at risk as some other nations with less developed infrastructure. But I think it's clear that basically everyone around the world is at some risk of it says here, 1 billion children are at extremely high risk of climate shocks, UNICEF says. So climate shocks is now, I guess, an operative term to discuss potential flooding and drought and fires and things like that. So there are a few statistics in here I wanted to just read because there aren't that many articles or, to my knowledge, there aren't that many pieces that sort of document the different types of risks that children face around the world with statistics. So I thought this was a really interesting thing to share. So first, I'll just say, it says here almost half of the world's 2.2 billion children, which is 1 billion children, are living in countries that face an extremely high risk of the impacts of the climate crisis, including environmental shocks such as cyclones and heat waves. And that was an index published by UNICEF, the UN Children's Agency. One of the places that has extremely high risk is Afghanistan, and because they've had a lot of prolonged drought and political instability. And of course, now with the Taliban in control, that is also creating a lot of stress and precariousness there. There's a little bit more here I wanted to say. It says children are the ones who will be most impacted by the crisis and the ones who will suffer the most from its consequences. That's a quote from Greta Thunberg. And she talks a little bit about the youth climate movement, which is really a movement that is a survival-based movement in the eyes of a lot of kids around the world. It says the 10 countries most at risk were all in Africa, with the Central African Republic, Chad, and Nigeria most vulnerable. Of course, there's a huge disconnect that it says between the countries that emit the most pollution in terms of greenhouse gases, which are not a pollutant in the traditional sense, but pollute our atmosphere by heating it. And so that's obviously a really important thing. But it said here, India was the only country that both recorded high CO2 emissions and was extremely high risk. While it is responsible for more than 7% of global CO2 emissions, it has a large population of more than 1.3 billion people, and its per capita emissions are only 1.8 metric tons. And I think that's just because it has such a high population. It says children in Iceland, Luxembourg, and New Zealand were least at risk. Those countries have small populations, but per capita, Iceland and New Zealand emit more than 6 metric tons of the world's emissions, while Luxembourg is more than 15, which is quite a bit more than twice, on par with Americans, Canadians, Saudis, and Australians. Then they basically just, at the bottom of the article, they explain just what are the different climate shocks. So it says 240 million children are highly exposed to coastal flooding. 400 million are highly exposed to cyclones, 820 million are highly exposed to heat waves, and 920 million children are highly exposed to water scarcity. So it's interesting because I always read about flooding as being an incredibly dangerous threat because it can kind of happen at any time. And it's not always easy for people to move away from the coast. But I was really almost shocked because it's 820 million for heat waves and 920 million for water scarcity. And that is, 4 and 5 times more than the coastal flooding and double what it is for the cyclones. So it seems here that there's kind of a theme about heat waves and water scarcity that seems to be much more widespread than just the flooding. So I just wanted to share that stuff. I thought it was fascinating, and I love to see if anybody has comments about that.
Well, that's certainly what I've been talking about, is that the heat and water scarcity are going to be one of the biggest problems. I know that especially in India, there's an aquifer that serves untold millions that is now at a quarter of its original capacity, with no chance for replenishing. And this scenario is repeated in multiple situations. So the thing that seems to be left out of the article is the food shortages. As soon as you get drought, you can't grow crops. As soon as you can't grow crops, then people can't eat. So it's the children in the heat wave risk areas and water risk areas will also be at risk for famine.
Greg, what was the aquifer that you were talking about?
I have it in the slides in one of the presentations. I can never remember the name for some reason, but I can go look it up.
Okay, because there was an article on the August 17th about the Lake Mead reservoir. Western U.S. states face federal water cuts for the first time amid reservoir shortage. So I guess the first time in history this has happened.
Yeah, I was just reading an article that said that California might start having severe water shortages by 2024. So that's basically in just 3 years. It's going to be tricky, and it's making me not want to buy a house here. It's scary.
Yeah, well, it's real because like this article says, U.S. officials on Monday declared the first ever water shortage from a river that serves 40 million people in the West, triggering cuts to some Arizona farmers next year amid a gripping drought, which is exactly what Greg was just talking about. So it's happening right now already, right here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I need to do more research about desalination. But it seems like desalination and the transportation of that desalinated water is going to be, $1 trillion industry if people can figure out how to do it without using too much CO2 and spending too much money. It's just so ironic that, this is like the water planet. I mean, if you look at Earth from space, it's covered in water. And yet here we are, trying to figure out if we're going to have enough water to just grow rice. It's like unbelievable. So I think desalination is going to be a big industry.
Could be. However, the worry, of course, is that we have lots of water to drink, but we choke to death on the fumes.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're definitely deep in a Dr. Seuss book, and the ending is yet to be written.
Yeah, I have a feeling that bringing in ice from other solar system sources is probably safer than desalination, to be perfectly honest.
Interesting. Yeah, the ice is a tricky one. As climate Twitter is always saying, you can't plant ice, where are you going to get it from?
Well, from the rings of Saturn.
No, it's pretty cold out in space. Only when it's how you get it from orbit into.
Yeah, because doesn't everything burn up when it comes back?
Well, they probably turn it into water on board some orbiting vessel, and have a really giant pipeline into the sky.
Yeah, the space elevators. A lot of people thought about that as well, but there are lots of interesting technical problems to solve. The thing is that the chemistry of the oceans is also so dramatically affected by climate change that we really haven't even begun to understand the consequences of how the ocean chemistry has been negatively impacted. And that's going to have all kinds of other knock-on effects, which are very hard to contemplate. And so I worry that a massive scale desalinization may exacerbate that in ways that we don't yet understand.
Oh, I see. Yeah. But also, though, like if we just remove the water from the ocean before we desalinate it, then also isn't that possibly helping against sea level rise if we do a lot of it? I mean, I don't think we should desalinate the water inside the ocean. That would be, I think, I agree with you, really scary.
Yeah, I mean, but the sea level rise is coming from the loss of the ice, and we sort of don't want to do that. But at the same time, the Earth is losing hydrogen anyway. It's just it's part of the way the atmospheric chemistry works.
Yeah, it's just floating away all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And I was really shocked to learn this. I just, I'm a poor, stupid mathematician. I don't know anything about atmospheric science or geophysics or the aquasphere. None of that is. I'm just now starting to learn little tiny bits and pieces. But I have a feeling that if we were to import ice, then one of the advantages is that we could replenish some of the hydrogen. So.
Fascinating. Okay, well, if there aren't any more comments about that, I'm going to bring up the next story, if that's okay. And then
I've put one in the message in the chat that I'd kind
of. Oh, okay. Do you want to talk about that after I do mine?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Lovely.
Perfect. Okay, so just the second story I had today is from The Guardian. I love The Guardian. If anybody is interested in learning more about climate and reading some sort of shorter usually, but incredibly well-researched articles about topics that rarely get attention in other platforms, other media outlets, I highly suggest The Guardian and clicking on environment. And then within environment, they have all these different categories: wildlife, energy, climate. Really, really great work in The Guardian. So this is something I thought would be interesting to discuss because Greg especially has mentioned it. It's talking about towns moving to higher ground. And it says here, a Midwestern town moved uphill to survive the elements. Can others do the same? So this is a very interesting sort of short little story about how a town in Illinois, I'm going to say it's called Valmeyer, but I'm not sure if I'm quite pronouncing that right. Valmeyer, Illinois, said it was hit by the Great Flood of 1993 and faced obliteration. So residents made the unexpected choice. The town decided to rebuild from the ground up, this time about 2 miles east and 400 feet higher. Valmeyer was a small commuter town made up of mostly middle-class families who worked in nearby St. Louis, Missouri. Almost overnight, the community became a model of what it means to become resilient, climate resilient. So basically they have a little map here, which shows that they used to live on a lake called Moordock Lake, and they basically moved the entire city. And they sort of talk a little bit about how they did that. It says building the new Valmeyer, as it is colloquially known, was no small feat. Not only did village officials have to draw up a new town from scratch, but they also had to persuade hundreds of residents who had lost their homes to the flood that moving would be worth it and that this venture could replace a lost community. The principal challenge was unlocking funding to aid with the transition. Nearly 2 decades later, it's an obstacle shared by many towns staring down their own growing environmental and climate concerns. It says, before the flood, which ravaged the town's commercial and residential properties, little more than 900 people lived in Valmeyer. The town was home to more than 300 houses, 25 businesses, 3 churches, and a school. About 90% of the properties were deemed beyond repair by appraisers. That's crazy to me. So basically, they already knew. They had somebody come and survey the properties, and basically it was sort of, toast largely. And it says here, at first, many residents planned on moving to nearby towns or even other states. But when a farmer on a neighboring hill offered to sell his land to Valmeyer as a site to rebuild, the tides turned. And they basically, they had a vote, it says, in a school gymnasium, and a majority supported rebuilding the town. It says village officials secured the funding necessary to make New Valmeyer a reality. Meanwhile, residents made down payments on plots for their new homes, generating about $500,000 as initial payment for the land. The final cost of buying the land and building the infrastructure of the new town was $35 million, which seems incredibly low to me, most of which was paid by state and federal sources. A groundbreaking ceremony took place just 4 months after the flood, so they made this happen fairly quickly. Although the population dipped to somewhere between 500 and 600 residents after the flood, today about 1,200 people call New Valmeyer home. So I guess they're saying that after they did all the work of moving and everything, that it attracted new residents to the town, probably because it was a safer place to be from a climate perspective. Then it goes a little bit into the demographics of the people. Obviously, this is sort of a smaller town, so moving a city would be much more difficult. And then also talks a little bit about a study done by the NRDC, National Resource Defense Council, study that was done in 2019. It said that reviewed nearly 30 years of FEMA data, found that it takes on average more than 5 years for the completion of a FEMA-funded buyout project after a flood. The studies found that, quote, wealthier homeowners may be able to absorb the costs associated with waiting for a buyout, such as finding temporary housing, thus making buyouts less accessible, less equitable, and less effective. So I guess if maybe FEMA doesn't really step in and support unless the people are really in need of the buyout to support moving or whatever is necessary. So I guess they're saying that with richer households, maybe that causes a little bit of a problem because people have other options and other ways to go. That was what I took away from that, but maybe that's not quite correct. Last thing I just wanted to say was that this article also points out some other places: Princeville in North Carolina, Napakiak, I'm just hoping that's how you say it, Napakiak, Alaska, Tahola, I think it's Tahola, Washington. And just sort of details a few other places that are also facing this same sort of question. And just goes into a little bit about some different places that are considering moving and just the obstacles there. And here in Princeville in North Carolina, the first example, which is 75 miles east of Raleigh in North Carolina. It was the first municipality to be incorporated and independently governed by Black Americans after the Civil War. So that's really fascinating. It says in the past 3 decades, Princeville has twice been hit by devastating floods. Apparently, some of the town was immersed in 23 feet deep water after a 1999 hurricane. But it's now, 20 years later, and they're still discussing with the Army Corps of Engineers that has agreed to spend about $40 million to strengthen the levee, which would, make the flooding less severe. So I just can't believe that 20 years later, they're still discussing this. So anyway, I'll pause there for comments. And then Steve, you're welcome to share your piece as well.
I was thinking about something that Greg said not long ago about how if you want to invest in your future, you should be less concerned about your financial investments and more concerned about your, I think, something like social investments. I can't remember how you worded it, Greg. But that really has rung true to me lately. I've been thinking about that and kind of trying to live my life more like that, trying to kind of nurture, the friends that I have and the resources that we all kind of combined together could utilize. And I don't know, I love this story.
Yeah, the way it showed up in my own mind is develop relationships with those people you can trust with your life.
Right. Yeah.
Less emphasis on those people you can trust with the next transaction.
Right. Yeah. That's great. I love that line of thinking. I think it's very wise. And it also made me think about my daughter's school, because in 2003, about 250 houses burnt down in the area where I live from a forest fire. And the emblem of the school is the phoenix rising from the ashes. It's amazing what communities can do when they start to work together towards a common goal.
It is indeed.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for people to get, a taste of this on a regular basis. I work with a group on Bainbridge Island called the Arcadia Group, and we often have these work days, and there's no intent in it for yourself. It's really just the opportunity to work together. And the last work day that we did, a friend had like 2 or 3 cords of wood that she needed to get moved, and so we all got together, and it was astonishing how, with 8 of us, how quickly we could load half a cord of wood into the back of a truck. It was just wow. It wasn't backbreaking effort. It's just like we could just get a cord of wood, and then we drove it off to what has become that area's sort of wood bank. I guess they're food banks in some places. This is a wood bank, so that elderly who are heating primarily through the use of fire, have wood that's already chopped. So that was a great experience. And then recently, like last week, working within the guitar craft community, and it's astonishing what can happen when people come together in music. We had all these people who were new to the guitar craft work, and yet the performance that was put on at the end, which only had 24 hours of preparation, was one of the best performances that I've ever seen in my life, and certainly the best sort of first performance by any guitar craft circle I've ever seen, and one of the best of all the guitar craft performances I've seen. So what can happen when people come together is truly magical, and there is reason for hope, and hope, of course, is unreasonable.
Was there a recording of that?
No, that's sort of one of the injunctions. No recordings. All of the groups that participated were encouraged to, if they wished, to record their practice sessions, but there was no recording. But you can ask all the eyewitnesses; they will tell you.
Yeah, one thing I love about the story, about the article, is just that they decided to work together. Like, they took a vote and they voted to move. And I just think that's such a courageous thing, because people were thinking about leaving and, just relocating to totally other places. And I just think it's so amazing that they just said, screw it, let's just do it together,
Yeah, that is great.
That it really came from the community, it wasn't that they, because there's other options, other things they could have done, but nobody told them they had to do it. They decided they wanted to do it. And I just think that's so cool.
And when we think about coordination, at least the kind of coordination that I'm trying to engender, it's really this kind of community-based, grounds-up coordination. I think we've had quite a lot of top-down coordination, and it has some advantages, but I think, we're going to be entering an era where top-down coordination is not going to be as effective because we don't have the ability to maintain the infrastructure that allows for an overarching top. And so more of this grounds up, grassroots, community-based self-organization is what I hope that we can support with the blockchain technology, with RChain's technology.
Yeah, I was thinking about paraphrasing that Wynston Churchill quote for RChain, in the sense that you could say something to the degree of co-ops are the worst way to run a layer one blockchain platform, except for all the others.
Yes, exactly. I can totally get behind that.
That's so great. And also I love that I'm not sure if it's a slogan that Shitzy wrote or that she just posted, but I love that idea of the queue list leaders.
Oh yeah. That's right. I think that was Atticbee.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's a great article. I highly recommend if you haven't seen it yet. It's on the blog. It's a good one. Another good article that kind of connects too is the Douglas Rushkoff article where he quotes RChain in it, because he's specifically talking about exactly what you were just talking about, Greg. The projects that are actually working on the kind of coordination aspect of it.
Yeah, that's a good article. That's a very good article. I liked it.
So should we pass the mic to Steve Ross-Talbot?
Yes.
Okay. So the link that I've picked up is from your favourite newspaper, Nora, The Guardian, but also from one of my favourite journalists, which is George Monbiot. And in this article, he's basically holding the BBC to account. And if you scroll down the article, if you have it up in front of you, there's a bit that starts only in 2018. I shall continue reading until you get there. A mere 36 years after Exxon came to the same conclusion, did the BBC decide that climate science is solid, and there is no justification for both siding it. But the nonsense continues. What both siding means is in any debate, you always have the alternate view. But if there is solid science to say that one view is correct and the other is incorrect, there's no need to have both sides. But despite that, and this was the thing that really got me, that last week it says a group of us revealed that the BBC has been teaching children about climate breakdown. The GCSE module, that's kind of what we do when we're 15, 16, on what's called BBC Bite Size, which is the BBC's education channel, which also is online. It listed the positive impacts of our global catastrophe. I mean, this almost sounds like it would be a joke, but it's not. Among them were more resources, such as oil, becoming available in places such as Alaska and Siberia when the ice melts. New tourist destinations becoming available, and warmer temperatures could lead to healthier outdoor lifestyles. So it was only when there was a social media storm that the BBC decided to remove that content. But the fact that the BBC was stupid enough to do this shows just how badly the BBC has been walked upon by the fossil fuel industry and its lobbyists, and how incapable it has been of really understanding the role of science, the importance of science, and therefore giving a balanced view. And this is George Monbiot's take on the BBC being incompetent in this regard. So I just thought I'd share that with you, because this is what, up until very recently, literally very recently, people of 15, 16 were being taught using the BBC Bite-Size service about climate change, that there were in fact positive impacts. I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah, he did a great little video story on Twitter for the publication called Double Down News.
Yes, I watched it.
Yeah.
I watched it, yeah.
And so some of the positive things, I think they were saying, like, okay, well, it's going to be a lot more drought, but certain shipping canals are going to be open because the ice is going to melt. And, and so like, maybe it's not that bad. It's just change. It's not. And the video he does is so amazing. And it's incredibly insidious, that kind of stuff. It's like, okay, yeah, we can drill for oil in new places in Siberia. Okay, is there water to drink? is there food? Can we grow food? It's so short-sighted, and I'm so glad you brought this up.
I mean, there's a little bit further down to do with the environment about, I think it's to do with Woman's Hour, which is quite a famous program on the radio. And it says, and it's all about a woman called Minette Batters, who's the head of the Farmers Union. And she was cited in BBC Woman's Hour, which is a really important program that's done largely by women for women, but lots of men listen to it because it's such a good program. And they talked about, 30 inspiring women whose work is making a significant positive contribution. And they placed Minette Batters ahead of some quite well-known environmental heroes, such as Gail Bardbrook and Judy Lingwall and Franny Armstrong and Safia Minney, amongst others. And for the BBC to do that, to put somebody who actually has sought to undermine the ban on pesticides, undermine the call for the badger cull to cease in this country, and also undermine efforts to go to meat-free consumption. And the BBC Women's Hour put her on a power list. I mean, disgraceful. That was fairly recently. I have had it with the BBC, and that's why I support Double Down News.
I wonder just how that kind of came about. There's been many books written about, the oil industry and how they influenced propaganda over the last decade against climate change. And I'm trying to find this one that I had read a while back, and I can't find it right now, but it got into quite a lot of detail about just, what exactly the tactics they used. I wonder, did BBC's, top officials kind of consider themselves being responsible because they were, listening to both sides? Were they beholden to the industry,
And that was the issue, that they got what the oil industry did was made the BBC feel that it needed to put both sides of the argument.
Right.
When in fact the science would suggest that you shouldn't do that. I mean, it's like having a panel to, discuss 2 + 2 = 4, and having somebody else there that's saying, no, 2 + 2 = 3.
Well, did you know that if you turn the plus on an angle, it actually becomes multiplication?
Yeah.
And but that actually is the same result. Oh, never mind. Okay.
Yes, yes, exactly. So the BBC, what they did was target the BBC on their impartiality, and they used a lot of money to target them, so that it kind of tied them up, and they weren't really thinking straight and looking at the underlying science, which they should have done. So they kind of questioned their moral judgment, I suppose, in order to make sure both sides were presented, even when they should not have done so.
Well, and there also, I think what's really interesting, and maybe George Monbiot kind of touched on this, but I think it's also interesting that, why do they care what the oil companies think if the oil companies think they're impartial? Well, I would venture to say it's probably pretty likely that they were getting a lot of advertising money from them.
Well, you don't on the BBC because there's no advertising.
Well, that's great. But on other, news networks, I think it's very likely that there is a lot of fossil fuel advertising money. So I guess maybe that's a question of why the BBC felt so compelled to appease, oil lobbyists who feel that they're impartial. I mean, who cares? But maybe there is some reason,
I think it's to do with, in this country at least, I don't know how it is with the public broadcasting services where in the States, because I think they operate a little differently, but with the BBC, one of the problems is that key appointments are made by government. So the government appoints the director of the BBC, and then they're supposed to take their hands off. But of course, normally there's been cross-party, bipartisan support for the director. But the last 2 directors, there wasn't. And it was the Conservatives that put their person in. And so for the first time, you've got the BBC with somebody at the top that has a more rightist view. And that more rightist view tends to be of the view that, that it's my right to not wear a mask. It's that sort of view. My human right to not wear the mask. and exercise that right, even though you would save somebody's life by wearing it.
What about my right not to get COVID when I go to Target?
It's, and ultimately that rightist view of the world,
exactly,
whilst it talks about freedom, it never talks about responsibility.
Right.
So it's freedom with no responsibility. Whereas what we want is freedom with responsibility.
Sure. And you also don't want responsibility with no freedom, right? You want both.
Exactly. You do want both.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting. And that double down news that you talked about, that, I mean, if any of you, if there's anyone on the call listening to the call later on, go look at it. It's well worth it. Well worth it. It's great articles.
Yeah, and they have amazing video pieces that they do that are not these like little 30-second clips. They have people talking for 5-10 minutes about different topics. And I know this is not really the subject we're discussing right now, but last week they put out a fantastic video with a British veteran who was talking about his experience in Afghanistan and his views on what happened. And it was courageous and just so well done. And, you rarely see, someone with that kind of life experience given that kind of airtime, on a major network, or they're being interviewed and the questions are kind of weird and, but really just allowing people to just speak their mind. And so, I'm a big fan of that platform. Yeah.
So, Greg, you were saying earlier before we started recording that something interesting has been happening in Casper land.
Yeah, give us 6.5 minutes of Casper.
Yeah, just a second. I'm washing my hands, but So this morning, Anton, aka Nutzipper, gave us a nice little presentation along with a demo and graphs. Where he shifted the finalization to finalization of states rather than finalization of blocks. And we're still making sure that there are no attack vectors in this, but it's quite compelling and it's really lovely. In the demo, he restarts various chunks of the network and it just chugs along. So like, and in certain cases, it's not just because he's testing. It's like he actually has some nodes going down because they're out of memory or for other reasons. And the network is completely resilient and responsive. And it is very, very compelling. They dramatically simplifies the code. So there's a bunch of there's a bunch of extra logic with respect to rejection that we can eliminate. So when we're doing merging of two blocks, it may be that we can merge the blocks as long as we reject some number of deploys. And then the question is whether or not that at finalization that we're sure that those are the deploys that have been rejected. Code has been a little bit tricky to manage, but when we shift from block finalization to state finalization, the rejection becomes a part of the state, and because it becomes a part of the state, it happens concomitantly with finalization. So if something gets finalized, what's finalized is all the deploys that are active along with all the deploys that have been rejected. And so no extra worrying about, okay, we have to wait till the next finalization window to make sure that all the rejections were really rejected. And this is just remarkable. It's a much cleaner way to do things. And I think, reflecting back on it, this was certainly the intuition that Vlad and I were talking about, was finalization of states, not finalization of blocks. So it lines up with the way we were, we were reasoning about it from the mathematical point of view. So blocks were kind of a proxy for state, but we do now have a much cleaner representation of state in terms of the deploys and the deploys that have made it and the deploys that have been rejected. So this is a very good thing, and it is only available through the representation of state using row length, or some channel-based process algebra dramatically facilitates this. You couldn't do the same thing with solidity or some of these others. It would be much, much, much harder. So essentially, the overhead of doing the calculation would completely erase any gain you got from speed.
Huh.
So does this give you a sort of how can I put it? It gives you access to a higher degree of semantics, because you're not just looking at it as a block, you're looking at it as state. And so does that give you, I can see why that's quicker. Does that give additional advantage? Because you must have somehow in that process an understanding of not just state, but the relationship between states.
Yes. So in particular, it's exactly this that I've been hoping to get to from the point of view of trying to jettison as much replay calculation as we can do. So in particular, if you go from state to state, then there's a clear formula that you can provide. So you take the what's called the characteristic type of the pre-state and the characteristic type of the post-state, and then you look at and then you say the pre-state linearly implies the post-state. So that's a formula that you can write down.
Yeah.
And then what you want to do is you want to say that the smart contracts that are in the deploy, together with the state of the tuple space, satisfy that formula. Yes. And if it turns out that is the case, and that verifying that formula is cheaper than doing the replay, then that's a way to avoid doing the replay.
Yeah. Well, that lends itself to some pretty potentially significant compressions.
Potentially. I mean, you have to be careful. It may turn out that there are lots of cases where validating the formula, that check is at least as hard or harder than just running the program. So
how much does when you add the sort of more behavioral type characteristics to the system as a whole, does that impact that finalization of state at all in a positive or negative way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, we're already beginning to employ this. So as a brief example, and then we should probably jump to the meeting. So Tomasov has introduced channels that only carry values from a commutative monoid, and so that's essentially type information. So we now know that these channels, only carry type. They don't carry code. They only carry values from a commutative monoid. So like the natural numbers, where you can add them, and addition, A plus B is the same as B plus A. So that is what's allowing us to merge the rev transaction states more rapidly, because we don't have to go through a lot of logical rigmarole. We could just know that when you merge them, all you do is add the values of the channels. So yes, that it's quite exciting, but we are over the time. So see everyone in the staff meeting.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to make that one.
Okay.
Thank you all for a great conversation.
Okay. Yeah, it's good one.